כלכלי. נתחיל מאנשי המילואים, ואנחנו מתחילים מהם מכיוון שהם באמת אלה שחשוב לנו כרגע לתת להם גיבוי מלא. כפי שכבר דיווחנו, אנחנו מקדימים את התשלום עבור ימי המילואים, 100% לשכירים, 125% לעצמאים, בלי טופסולוגיה.
That clip that you just heard and saw if you're watching on YouTube is the Minister of Finance for Israel, Bezalel Smotrich, speaking shortly after the war with Hamas broke out in 2023. And he's addressing economic issues, he says. He's really addressing very small payments and accommodations and allowances for Israeli citizens who are being hit hard and were being hit hard from day one by the war. In the ensuing 14 months, Minister Smotrich has said very little about the macroeconomic situation in Israel. So, State of Tel Aviv turned to former Governor of the Bank of Israel, Karnit Flug, a repeat guest and friend of the podcast. We spoke to her earlier in January, and we get into the big issues that we need to be speaking about more. So, let's do this. I'm Vivian Berkovich, a former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and now working hard to keep everybody informed, myself included. Stay with us. It's Wednesday, January 2nd, just before noon in Israel. Karnit Flug, so good to see you. Thank you for joining State of Tel Aviv today.
Thank you. It's nice to see you again.
I know, it's been a while. And I've been meaning to get in touch with you to return to the show with your unparalleled insights and knowledge, because we State of Tel Aviv people, we need to hear from an economist who knows their stuff. And dare I say, the whole country needs to pay more attention to what's going on. So we're going to just dive right in and get going, because we have a lot of ground to cover today. In normal times, which we are not in, would say Happy New Year, but that just doesn't feel appropriate. And so I'll say, wishing you all the best, and all our listeners as well, for a safe and healthy New Year. We need a new lexicon. Happy doesn't quite work right at the moment. And that the hostages be returned immediately.
I join your wishes.
Thank you. So, Karnit, Israel has been at war now for 15 months. And we spoke before the war about the impact of the judicial reform-related unrest on the economy. And at that time, your concerns were profound. And I can only imagine what you are thinking and have to say today. So I want to invite you to just offer a very macro, global summary of how you see the Israeli economy today, and what are your major concerns as a decades-long experienced economist, former governor of the Bank of Israel, academic, and still very active in the field. What are your red flags? And what do you see?
So I will start by saying that if somebody would have told me after 15 months of a war, the economy will be doing okay, we're not in a recession, there is virtually no unemployment, and the economy is functioning, I would think that it can't be. And so, in a sense, I think the resilience that the economy has exhibited over this time is quite remarkable, and we can talk about the main, sources of resilience, but it's still quite amazing. So on the positive side, I think this is definitely something that we can, I've always talked about the resilience of the economy, and we've seen that during shorter wars and coming out of COVID and after the global financial crisis. And still, I don't think I would have expected this kind of strength if I would know that there would be such a long war. So this is on the positive side, of course, and we will talk about the costs of the war in terms of the economy and in terms of the public finances and so on. But still, I mean, that's the first thing I would say. On the other hand, I think there are major risks going forward. And I think that if we don't tackle them, we may not see a crisis, we may just see a very slow decline. And it has to do with the burden of the war and the additional defense spending that are going to be quite heavy. And they mean higher taxes, lower public services, and so on. I think that will have an effect on the on people that are the most able, that may decide that the burden is too high and too heavy, both the economic burden, the burden of serving in the reserve, the sense of inequality and unfairness, that the burden is so concentrated on them. These people can leave. It may have quite heavy effects on the ability of this economy to flourish. And I think so. These things are tied together, but I think that if the burden is too heavy, it may actually lead the most able, the most innovative people to just decide to either take their businesses or take themselves elsewhere. They're courted in other places. Add to that the return of the judicial overall. And I think all of these things put the long term at risk. So this is sort of, if I have to summarize, there is the positive, but there are very serious risks ahead.
Okay. Well, I mean, that was a bit of an unfair question because it's so big. But let's get into some of the details now, into the weeds. The numbers, and I don't know, these numbers are so big that so far Israel has spent something like 45 billion US dollars on the war, that the cost to the economy is approximately $70 billion to date, or has been to date. I mean, these are enormous numbers. And I think that to most people, myself included, they're very abstract. And so we want to understand, well, what does it mean for us? What is this going to mean in people's lives? So let's step back for a moment, because we've had in the last year, I believe, several downgrades by the major rating agencies in New York, correct? And which means, of course, that the cost of borrowing for the state is increased, it's higher, and that is going to trickle down, and we are seeing it trickle down to ordinary people who have to pay mortgages and bills and, as you say, also be superheroes in the last year. And I just want to sketch that out for our listeners who may not appreciate the challenges of living here in the last 15 months. If you are in your 30s or 40s and you have a family and you are called up for reserve duty, and many men and some women have served over 200 days of the last 15 months in reserve duty, and it's very tough going, and the state already was in this collective trauma. They're gone from home, their wives have to carry the load, the kids are, everything's unstable, everything's changed, everything's uncertain. And the lucky ones come home. And many of them come home to businesses that they have to either declare bankruptcy or that they have to shut down voluntarily. And there's no money. And at the same time, we've just seen an increase of 1% in the goods and services tax, the VAT, from 17 to 18%, to just a clear tax grab to fill the coffers that are not bringing in the tax revenue that the government needs. A lot of numbers I just threw out.
Yeah.
I know. But let's start with the credit rating. I just wanted I wanted all our listeners to be kind of on the same plane and to understand today, yesterday, what we woke up to. So you now can explain how it all works and how people are going to feel in their day-to-day lives, what we're seeing. Let's start with the Moody's downgrade and others that are relevant.
Well, I think the downgrading by the rating agencies, what it means most directly is it increases the cost of financing the deficit by the government. And it also sort of affects the overall cost of borrowing, the interest rates that businesses are paying, and so on. And so, what it means is basically that the government will have to pay more. It will have to pay more or in interest because its debt has increased. It increased from 60% of GDP to 67 or 8% of GDP. So the size of the debt is higher, and the interest that that the government pays is higher, which means that's part of what it will have to cover, either by cuts in spending or by raising more revenues. And the government decided, and the has already been approved. Most of it has already been approved by the Knesset to raise more taxes. And we can go through all these elements of the taxation, and to cut services. And that will definitely make life more difficult for mostly for the middle class that already had difficulties in, how do you say, making ends meet, or
Exactly
basically,
how you say it.
oh,
Yes.
well, and actually this part of the population will definitely feel it, that life is more difficult. So in terms of numbers, the main elements of the government decisions of how to raise more taxes include freezing tax brackets, which basically means, in Israel, tax brackets are indexed to inflation. So they keep the levels at which you pay higher taxes in real terms constant. If you freeze them, it means that it actually reduces the income at which you move to higher tax brackets. So it basically is a way of increasing the income tax in a less transparent way that you would expect it to be. But I think that actually is a very important step, because it's progressive. So people with higher income will actually feel a higher cost in terms of paying higher taxes. So this is one element. Then the wages in the public sector were frozen, and the fact, actually, there was a wage agreement that was supposed to start giving higher wages to people in the public sector. That has been postponed. So people in the public sector will feel actually a wage cut relative to where they would have been. And there are a lot of price hikes in the utilities, public transportation. Actually, that's not a utility, but that prices are going to go up, water, energy, and so on. And the VAT. So it's a mix of raising prices of utilities, of public transportation, and taxation. Altogether, if we look at what it means for a median household, we're talking about a cost of about 10,000 shekels a year. It's very significant, and it's especially significant for people who are, just their income more or less just matched their expenditure, and that's a heavy burden. By the way, in terms of the overall package, I would say that it's actually makes sense, in the sense that there are large elements that actually will affect people with high income. the so-called locked profits, which I will not go into what exactly it means, but it's taxing people, actually companies that did not distribute dividends in order to avoid taxes. So now they will be taxed. I think it's only fair, and actually the total amount that is supposed to be collected from this particular tax is almost 10 billion shekels, and it's really only taxing the highest income people. And there is another element, which is a excise tax on people with very high incomes that will also be increased. So I think in terms of the distribution of the measures, they're actually taxing most heavily people with high income. Some of the intended measures that were supposed to be very broad actually were not at the end part of the package. For example, there was the initial intention was to freeze child allowances, but they're not frozen. And there were some other elements that were taken out. The main regressive part of the package is the VAT, which because people with lower income spend a higher proportion of their income, consume a higher proportion of their income, so the VAT affects them relatively more. But I think given the need to actually go through, I mean, to raise revenues at the amount that was decided upon, I think it makes sense to have some of the measures also affect, the lower parts of the income distribution. So I think that overall the measures are reasonable. The main element that is missing is giving up the coalition money, or the resources that go to the special interest groups that are represented in this government. And the main part that has not been cut, unfortunately, is the budget which goes to the Haredi educational system that doesn't provide core curriculum and that is not, how do you say, controlled not supervised, not controlled in a reasonable way. I think doing that would give the government much more credibility that it's serious, and would also would have made it possible to reduce somewhat the burden on the overall population.
On that 40% that seems to do and feel that they do everything. So let me just interject here, because I want to make clear that what you're talking about, of course, is the new package of taxes and other economic measures that was voted on in a very dramatic Knesset session on December 31st. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was recovering in hospital from some not minor surgery, having his prostate removed. And he was weak. He's 75 years old. He wears a pacemaker. And his allies, so-called allies in the coalition, who represent these special interest groups that you referred to, one was Minister Goldknop, who represents the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, and the other was Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a very far, hard right, many consider to be extremist. And they threatened to pull votes and literally forced the prime minister to leave his hospital bed against doctors' orders to make sure that the measures were approved. And they did squeak through on one vote, on his vote. Just to give people a sense of the underbelly, this seems to constantly just permeate everything that goes on here, which is unfortunate. But these measures, notwithstanding these measures, which the government, of course, hopes will bring in much needed revenue, we also saw the other day some figures released that were concerning year-end figures. And I know that over the course of your career, you've taken particular interest in worker mobility and human resource related issues. We've certainly talked about that in the past. The numbers are spiking. I don't remember the exact percentage, but it was more than double. In 2024, somewhere around 80,000 people left Israel on what is considered to be a permanent basis. Most of these people were young families, well educated, and from the center, as we call it, of the country, which is where a lot of talent, industry, business, everything is clustered and concentrated. And these were this was exactly what you were warning about when I last spoke to you, your concerns regarding people and exactly those people who we most need and want for a prospering and prosperous economy. It seems that they're voting with their feet. Now, I just want to add on to that the 2024 departures are considered to be residual, that they made their plans in 2023 as a result of judicial reform and other things that were going on. And so they're not necessarily directly related to October 7th, to the pressures of raising a family under constant war, in a state of constant war. And the concern, I believe, is that 2025 will see those numbers increase even more. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that there is a risk, and as I said, I see the exit or the emigration of young, talented, able, innovative people as one of the major risks for the future of the country. I think it's too early to judge whether the numbers that we have seen that were published recently of people who left actually towards the end of 23, because the Central Bureau of Statistics, they look at people who haven't been here for a year and so on. So it's really only the beginning of the phenomena. And I think it's too early to say whether it's really representing a new tendency or path. But I think the risks are there. And the risks are related to the burden that I mentioned, the burden of serving hundreds of days on reserve. I mean, my son-in-law was 270 days in reserve duty. I mean, that's something that, is really beyond what people are willing to put up with. And if you add to that all the economic burden of all the measures that we talked about, and the sense that there is a deterioration in our democracy because of the return of the judicial reform, and the sense of injustice that you are bearing the burden and there are some groups that are exempt. I think that these are forces that may actually push people to make the decision to leave. Now, I think there is a lot that the government can do about it. I think if there is a change, and if the Haredi will start actually serving at large numbers, that would mean that the burden on the reservists will be lower. By the way, it has huge economic impact because the cost of reservists to the defense budget is like 3 times higher than the cost of people in the basic duty. So that can make a huge change also from economic standpoint, and obviously from the standpoint of equality and justice. So I think this is extremely important. if the Haredi would start serving, also the chances are that afterwards they will get the skills and will have a meaningful engagement in the labor market. So I think that um, this is really key for a more positive path. Is it likely now, given the composition of the coalition? I can't say. Unfortunately, it doesn't look very promising.
I just want to fill in some of the spaces in what you just said because it's so important. And will be speaking, and I do speak constantly with others, political and military and security experts on the implications of the Haredi exemption from the draft. But to our listeners, when Karnit mentions, for example, her son-in-law, who I will assume is in his 30s or 40s, who has a family serving 270 days in reserves, this is just a guy who has a job, who's a productive member of society, who leaves everything and is serving, is fighting in a war, is not able to come home very often, if at all. Think that through into your own lives because it's it's unprecedented here. Israel is not built for long wars, and I think that I'm actually challenged to think of any democracy where that might occur today. I mean, and I'll just leave Ukraine to the side because I think it's a very different kind of situation there. And the other phenomenon that we're seeing is many of these men showing up in their 40s into their 50s for combat reserve duty. They don't have to show up. By law, they don't have to show up, but they do. And the effort and devotion and motivation is extraordinary and to be commended, but it must be shared. And of course, when you were referring to the Haredi exemptions, it's people like Minister Goldknopf, the Minister of Housing, who represents United Torah Judaism in the Knesset. He's the sort of conglomerate party leader. And they voice these concerns openly and often. They say, nope, we're not sending our boys. They've got to study Torah. They've got to pray for the preservation of the country. And if they go to the army, then they might come home less religious or not religious at all. And we're saying, really? We're worried that when we send our sons and husbands and fathers, they may not come home. I mean, there's a way. We've got to find a way to make this work. Okay, put the army aside because I have many, many more questions and issues to raise with you, and we don't have all day, unfortunately. Early on, there was a lot of talk in the earlier days of the war about a slowdown of capital, foreign capital coming into the country. The inflows of foreign capital investing in Israeli businesses and Israeli tech in particular is significant. And I know that it's impacting all levels of the tech ecosystem, but it's hammering the startup sector. And I'm wondering what you have to say about that, because I would think that those people, the innovators in the startup sector, are exactly the people we need and want to retain in the country.
Yeah. So after actually, well, we've seen an extremely high amount of capital flowing in during the years 2021, 2022. Then we saw a sharp decline in 23, which actually was everywhere, not only in Israel, but in Israel it was sharper. And partly it was the sharper decline was attributed to the judicial overall. What we see in 24 is actually some increase in the overall capital flowing to the tech sector in Israel. So it's hard to say, to talk about trends, but we haven't seen a further decline. However, one concern is that the capital that did flow in was quite concentrated into specific sectors, especially into the cyber sector. So it's hard to say whether it's, just sort of a uptick due to a global concern about cybersecurity. But uh, generally, I would say that the operation of this sector, capital flows, activity, number of employees, and so on, was quite strong in 2024. So I think this is definitely good news. Regarding the future, it's hard to say. There's some concern that some elements of BDS are sort of raising concerns, and there is some reluctance by some VCs to invest in Israel. I hope that doesn't expand. It will also depend on how Israel handles itself.
Indeed. The defense sector, particularly startups in the defense sector, my understanding is that niche is on fire in a good
It's
way.
doing very, very well, and Israeli exports have actually gone up, partly thanks to a very substantial surge in the demand from the defense industry. I think it's due to two main reasons. One is, unfortunately, conflicts around the world are broader now, and there is a decision by European governments and others to spend more on defense. And the other is that they see actually the performance of things that are coming from the Israeli defense industry. They see how they actually are used in combat and in defense. So that's actually, I'm not sure if to call it a silver lining, but yes, there is a positive sort of effect of the war and of wars elsewhere on Israeli defense industry.
And one of the things that I've learned, I have a very good friend who's established a defense tech focused fund. And I've learned a lot from him in recent months. This whole issue of asymmetrical warfare, which of course Israel is faced with. You get a $20 drone that
Right.
Houthis modify and send over, and we need $1 million missiles and batteries to blow it up. So this whole issue of asymmetrical warfare is really hard baked into I hate to use this phrase, but I will, the military industrial complex that we have in the States, that we have in Europe. And the production and the innovation has been geared towards conventional war, what we understood to be conventional war. And in fact, in Israel and in many places, everyone was saying, it's all going to be technology. We won't need soldiers on the ground anymore. War is going to be, in cyberspace. Well, we now know that's not true. So there's a real shift. And as you say, there are a lot of very positive lessons being learned, unfortunately, on the battlefield about what works, what doesn't, what needs to be modified. And that is feeding into the Israeli defense tech sector. One thing I've also been made aware of is the fact that we have large pension funds, significant pension assets that sit in Israel. Now, as you know, I'm Canadian, and where I come from, Canada certainly is not a monster economy, but because we have some pretty strong socialist leanings in Canada, we also have huge pension funds. Some of the largest sources of private equity in the world, in fact, are Ontario Teachers and others. But in Israel, we have the same phenomenon. We have very, very large amounts of capital sitting in pension funds. My understanding is that they are underweighted in the tech sector in this country, which accounts for about 20%
Of
of
the economy.
exactly. So I'm going to anticipate that you're going to tell me that that's a risk-averse strategy, that they're trying to manage their risk exposure, right? Because of
Of
course, startup
course.
and of course.
Return and risk.
Okay, so I just end run all of that. I anticipated that well. But here's what I want to ask you, because we need money. And we need to encourage our people to stay, and we need to provide resources to support the critical part of the economy. Should be considered that we take some of these resources and put them back into the economy?
Yeah, I'm not sure what it means we take, but I'll say I think the
What's that?
well, no, I understand. I understand what you
You know what I
mean. So I think the main consideration of those who are managing our money is to ensure a high enough return that these savings will yield so that we have, reasonable pension when we are pensioners. Okay, so I think this should be the main consideration. I think the government can consider providing some incentives to sort of funnel some of these resources, uh, for example, towards infrastructure investment. By the way, infrastructure investment is very important for all the business sector, for high tech and not for high tech. And we are behind in terms of our infrastructure. And it can also provide some other incentives to invest in some sectors, but that means it may provide either additional yield or some safety net. I don't think by law you should direct investment to go somewhere where the investors would not go otherwise, because that would mean either taking higher risk or giving up return. And I think when we want to save and we're forced to save for our old age, the consideration should be basically guaranteeing that we will have the highest pension possible. But if you're willing to pay for it, I mean, the government generally pays for infrastructure investment. It could actually provide some incentives, either by safety net or by some additional compensation. And this way, it would actually make it a reasonable decision to invest in these areas. So I think not by law, but by incentives, you could do that.
Absolutely. So, yes, I didn't mean to take as in, a controlled or command
No,
economy.
no, I understand.
Yeah.
But there are ways to do. There are ways to reach certain social goals, as long as it doesn't come at the expense of the standard of living of people who have been saving all their lives in order to guarantee a certain standard of living when they retire.
Yeah, and it's the basic concept, of course, of the fiduciary duty of, you pay into a fund on exactly the understanding you say, and the shepherds, those who are stewarding our money, we expect the highest standards of due diligence from them. We may not always get
Right.
it, but we expect it. Okay, so here we are, Karnit, the beginning of 2025. And I think that overall what you're saying is not great, could be worse, could be a lot worse, could be better. And some of the most significant impediments to improving the overall economic situation of Israel and Israelis um, really lies in the direction that the government takes.
Yeah, I think that's true. And maybe I can say, on the one hand, really the economy exhibited an unbelievable resilience, and it's functioning. It hasn't gone into a recession. Unemployment is low. And in that sense, it's quite remarkable. And it's, I think, thanks to macroeconomic stability. We entered this crisis with very low debt, relative to GDP. with a very active and independent central bank, with high foreign exchange reserves, with high surplus in the current account of the balance of payments, with a surplus of assets over liabilities in foreign exchange, very strong high-tech sector. All of these, I think, are elements of resilience. And as you said, I think going forward, the continued flourishing of the economy will really depend on how the government handled things. And we talked about some of the elements of that.
Yeah, and I think so. Just to sum up, I think that the top two issues in terms of how the government handles things are, number one, if they aggressively push and promote legislative judicial reform on the agenda in the coming year, because that will with certainty lead to massive social division and disruption,
Yeah.
which is one of the main factors many believe led to October 7th. And the other issue is whether or not this government will show a degree of willingness to require the ultra-Orthodox population not only to serve in the army, but to work, and at the same time to reduce their financial entitlements, which are a huge burden. Is that a fair distillation of what you would identify as the two top concerns going forward?
That, and I would say one additional concern, which we haven't talked about, is the additional spending on defense and how it will be financed, because we're talking about beyond financing the war, also about the need to increase the army and to spend more on defense, and how exactly it's going to be financed, and whether it will add additional burden on those who already bear the burden, I think will also be very important.
Well, Karnit, thank you so much for your time, as always, your insights. I'm definitely going to want to check back in with you in a few months when we see how things are going, because who knows what tomorrow brings.
Yeah, let's hope that this year is going to be much better than last year, and let's hope for the return of the hostages.
Amen to that. And I have to just say, though, I'm not pushing my luck. I'm asking for a sliver of light. I'm asking for just a little better, not a lot, and then we can work from there. Thank you. Have a good day, and best wishes for a good year. Thanks so much for tuning in. Always great to have you here. And please like us, ring the bell if you're on YouTube. Support us. Algorithms, they need clicks and likes and bells and all that stuff. Okay, see you next time. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Yon Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.